New survey shows opposition to the Occupy movement goes up. A $2 trillion plan to boost the world economy over the next 5 years. And a Sierra Leone doctor with Ebola now in the United States receiving treatment.
Good evening. It's day 50 of the Occupy protests. Demonstrators remain out on the streets in Admiralty, Causeway Bay and Mong Kok. A Chinese university survey has found an increase in respondents who don't support the Occupy movement compared with last month. The results also show that 40% of pan-democratic camp supporters believe it's time for occupiers to leave the protest zones.
The injunctions to remove barricades could be carried out within days. It's now understood that police will assist bailiffs to execute the injunction at CITIC Tower in Admiralty.
The Centre for Communication and Public Opinion survey polled some 1,000 people aged 15 and above between November the 5th and 11th. About 43% of the respondents don't support the Occupy movement, 8 percentage points higher than last month. There was a slight decline among those who support the movement, falling from nearly 38% to just under 34%. And 67% of the respondents believe protesters should leave the occupied sites immediately, with only about 14% disagreeing. But over 50% of the respondents believe the government needs to make more concrete compromises to resolve the current standoff. The interviewees were also asked whether or not lawmakers should pass a political reform proposal based on the framework set by Beijing to implement one person, one vote in the 2017 CE election. 46% of the respondents said such a proposal should be voted down, while 36% supported its passage. But if all corporate votes were replaced with individual votes in the future nominating committee, 45% of the respondents said the proposal should be passed, more than those who still think it should be vetoed. The researchers say in a breakdown of the data, 40% of those who classified themselves as supporters of the pan-democratic camp said the movement should consider retreating now.
I don't think that people who say that the movement should retreat is totally dismissing on that, maybe there are some reasons, for them to stay too. But I think, for every individual citizen and also for every activist, for the movement organizers, they have to weigh the pros and cons of the two different strategies, of whether to stay or to retreat. And it seems that it just happens to be the case that even among the pan-democrats, a slightly more a larger proportion of citizens, after weighing the pros and cons, slightly more a larger number of pan-democrat supporters would think that it's better to retreat right now.
And we apologise for the technical problems we experienced at the beginning of the last story. On to the next story on the Occupy movement. And there's word tonight that the injunction orders against Occupy protesters would be enforced this week. Bailiffs are expected to begin removing barricades at CITIC Tower in Admiralty first, before moving on to the Mong Kok site. Diane To has that story.
The injunctions to remove barricades could be carried out within days. It's now understood that police will assist bailiffs to execute the injunction at CITIC Tower in Admiralty as early as Tuesday. As for the court orders relating to the Mong Kok protest site, there are still a number of procedures that need to be completed, so it's still not yet clear when action would be taken. Protesters have been told of the consequences of resistance.
We have been speaking to people in the occupation areas which the injunction order involves, and we tell them the possible criminal consequence they may come across with contempt of court.
Leung adds that students will monitor closely any clearance operations and cast some light over what's next for the so-called umbrella movement. She said they will continue to push for a by-election at the Legislative Council as a de facto referendum on political reform. Scholarism leader Joshua Wong also said activists taking part in the occupations are ready to face the consequences, and he slammed the government for not leaving room for dialogue.
after Federation students cannot go to can't go to Beijing, scholars believe that we still hope to get a room to fight for universal suffrage, but the attitude of the government are quite strong and do not leave enough room for us to have any conversation or discussion.
Wong expressed disappointment that a letter students sent earlier to the central government had so far gone unanswered. Meanwhile, Liberal Party lawmaker James Tian pointed out that Leung Chun-ying should facilitate dialogue to help resolve the political impasse.
I think the chief executive, in our case, since the government doesn't have any vote in the Legislative Council, he must have a good relationship with the Pan-Democrats. Another role he must play is that he's elected by the 1,200 electoral voters in Hong Kong, but he's appointed by Beijing. So therefore, he must play an important role to exchange the views on behalf of the Hong Kong people with Beijing.
Joanna Silva, TVB News.
A group of students rallied during the G20 summit in Australia in support of the Occupy protests. They voiced support for the pro-democracy campaign in Hong Kong outside the summit venue in Brisbane. Illustrations of world leaders carrying yellow umbrellas were on display. Some of the students there said bringing democracy to Hong Kong would help bring democracy to the mainland as well.
And staying with the G20 summit, leaders of the group of 20 leaders unveiled a $2 trillion plan to boost the world economy. As they wrapped up their summit in Brisbane today, G20 host Australia called that real practical outcomes, rejecting claims that the summit is simply a talking shop. James Wong has more.
A bit of local flavor added to a world summit. G20 leaders cuddled Australia's iconic koalas in Brisbane. Still, there was serious business to be discussed, specifically the health of the global economy. On the final day of their summit, G20 leaders finalized a plan comprising more than 800 new measures. The goal is to boost world economic growth by 2.1 percentage points, or more than $2 trillion in value over 5 years, by investing in infrastructure and increasing trade. Also, there's a plan to reduce the gender gap in the workforce over the next decade, which would mean creating jobs for 100 million more women.
This year, the G20 has delivered real, practical outcomes, and because of the efforts that the G20 has made this year, culminating in the last 48 hours, people right around the world are going to be better off, and that's what it's all about.
Countries will hold one another accountable by monitoring implementation of their commitments to boost growth.
And I think if everyone keeps those promises, and we will certainly keep the promises that we've made, you will see extra growth, extra jobs, and a boost to the world economy.
And U.S. President Barack Obama talked up the past week he spent in the Asia-Pacific, calling it a strong week for American leadership. Before the G20 summit in Brisbane, he also attended the APEC meetings in Beijing and the East Asia summit in the capital of Myanmar. And it was announced today China will host the 2016 G20 summit.
I want to make it absolutely crystal clear here, as I always do, that the transformation of China, the lifting of hundreds of millions of people from poverty to the middle class, is perhaps the most extraordinary advance in human welfare in all of history. And it's been done peacefully. Isn't that extraordinary? Isn't that absolutely extraordinary?
Jameson Wong, TVB News.
US President Barack Obama and European leaders held talks today on the situation in Ukraine on the sidelines of the G20 summit. Russian President Vladimir Putin left Australia shortly before that meeting. While in Brisbane, Putin said there was a good chance of resolving the conflict in Ukraine. European leaders have threatened to slap additional sanctions on Russia unless Moscow withdraws its troops from Ukraine and ends support for the rebels. Meanwhile, Russian state TV released satellite images that it claims showed a Ukrainian fighter jet shot down Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 back in July. Both Kiev and Washington dismissed the Russian claims, with a Ukrainian government spokesman rejecting the pictures as fakes. All 298 people on board the jetliner died when it went down over a rebel-held area in eastern Ukraine. Japan, the US and Australia have promised to deepen their military cooperation. That's seen as part of efforts to counter China's growing influence in the region. On the sidelines of G20, US President Barack Obama, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott also pledged to work together to strengthen maritime security in the Asia-Pacific. This was the first meeting among leaders of the three allies since 2007. But there were no announcements on specific military exercises or new troop deployments within the region.
Also in Brisbane, China and Brazil agreed to boost railway cooperation between the two countries. President Xi Jinping met his Brazilian counterpart Dilma Rousseff today on the sidelines of the G20 summit. The two leaders called for early substantial progress in China-Brazil railway cooperation, such as building freight and high-speed rail systems in Brazil and a transcontinental rail link between Brazil and Peru in South America. Xi also hopes Brazil will actively support and participate in the first ministerial meeting of a China-Latin America forum to be held in Beijing next year.
On to some other news now. An Islamic State militants fighting in Iraq and Syria claimed in a video posted online today that they had beheaded American hostage Peter Kassig. The apparent execution has already been condemned by the Prime Ministers of Britain and Australia. Kassig had been working as an aid worker in Syria before being kidnapped last year. The White House says it's trying to verify the video. It comes as America's top military officer told troops in Baghdad that the momentum in the battle with the Islamic State was turning. Dempsey also met with Iraqi officials and military officers, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, predicted the drawn-out fight against ISIS would last several years. A surgeon from Sierra Leone who is critically ill with Ebola is in the United States for emergency treatment. Meanwhile, authorities in Mali are struggling to contain an outbreak in the West African country following the deaths of 3 people there. A surgeon who contracted Ebola while working in Sierra Leone is being treated in the US state of Nebraska. He's at a biocontainment unit where 2 other people with the disease have been successfully treated. Dr. Martin Salia landed in Omaha last night and was taken to the Nebraska Medical Center. The team caring for him in Sierra Leone indicated he was critically ill and possibly sicker than the first patient successfully treated in the US. Salia, a Sierra Leone citizen who is also a US resident, first showed Ebola symptoms on November 6th, but tested negative for the virus. He eventually tested positive on Monday. The US State Department said it helped Salia arrange his medical evacuation from Sierra Leone, but that the costs were covered by him privately. Over in England, pop stars and musicians, including boy band One Direction, U2 frontman Bono and Ellie Goulding, joined forces to record a charity song to raise funds for the Ebola crisis. The recording is a new version of the Band Aid charity single Do They Know It's Christmas, which was first recorded 30 years ago to raise funds for famine relief in Ethiopia.
All pop singers can do is sing, write the songs. That's the most they can do, give up whatever they're doing.
The fight against Ebola needs all the help it can get, given that Mali has become the latest West African nation to deal with a possible outbreak. Reports of new Ebola cases in Mali over the past few days have shaken people's faith that authorities there can speedily contain the spread of the virus.
Still ahead in the news tonight. A slow drive rally pressing for universal pension scheme. A top local Buddhist leader dies at age 95. And highlights of the Macau Grand Prix.
He was chained his whole life.
Turbo needs some love.
Like her, definitely give him the business card. The best thing you can do to a dog, they never had a purpose in his life, is to give him a purpose. Dog pursues happiness by using his body, mind, and heart.
Tuesday, Cesar Millan's leader of the pack at 8:30 on Pearl.
You've spent a lifetime building wealth. Now